My name is Jordan Ellis. I'm 34 years old. I was raised by a single father until I was 12, when he passed away suddenly from a heart attack. My mother remarried a few years later, and while she tried to blend our new family into something whole, there were always cracks in the seams. Her new husband, Derek, never had much patience for me, and his son, Tyler, was the kind of person who'd flash charm like currency and spend it fast. My father didn't leave much behind, but he did leave me his Rolex, a classic Submariner. Nothing ostentatious, just a quiet symbol of the years he worked hard to build a life for us. That watch was my only anchor to him, my only inheritance, my only heirloom. After college, I moved across the country to take a job in design, and I left the Rolex in my old room, tucked in a velvet case beneath a loose floorboard. I never thought anyone would touch it. It wasn't flashy enough to draw attention, and I'd always made it clear to my mother what it meant to me. Every visit home, I'd check it quietly, like I was making sure my father's memory hadn't been erased in my absence. The last time I checked, it was still there. That was 6 months ago. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was halfway through my second coffee and knee-deep in project revisions when I noticed a missed voicemail. A man's voice, gravelly, deliberate, said, "Hi, I'm Pete from Southside Pawn. I think you'll want to come by. There's something in this watch you need to see. Something personal. It's not for sale anymore. Not until you and I talk." At first I assumed it was a mistake, maybe a scam, but when he described the Rolex down to the faint scratch across the bezel and the inscription on the back, my stomach dropped. I called my mother first. I didn't accuse her. I just asked if she'd been in my room recently. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Oh, Jordan, we thought you didn't care about that old thing anymore." That we told me everything I needed to know. She'd sold my father's watch, my watch, to help fund Tyler's latest startup, a luxury smoothie subscription box that he pitched as a revolution in wellness. He had already failed 2 businesses before that. But somehow she believed this one was different. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I thanked her for her honesty and ended the call. Then I booked a red-eye flight home. I didn't go there to fight. I went to collect what was mine, and what was left of my father's memory. But what I found in that pawn shop changed everything, because inside that watch, hidden in the casing, was something no one knew existed, not even me. Pete, the owner, handed it to me with gloves and reverence. He said, "Son, I've been opening watches for 20 years. But this one had a secret." And what he showed me next, well, that's when the quiet revenge began. Pete laid the watch on a soft cloth, the way a historian might reveal an artifact. He unscrewed the case back slowly, carefully, like he'd rehearsed it a dozen times before I arrived. There was a note, he said, folded so tight it fit between the rotor and the case. My breath caught. He slid a small, yellowed piece of paper toward me. My father's handwriting, I'd know it anywhere. Strong cursive, a little slanted, the way he used to write my lunch notes when I was a kid. I unfolded it with trembling hands. It read, "To my son, if anything happens to me, don't let them take this from you. It's not just a watch. Look closer, you'll know when it matters." My mind raced. What else was hidden? Pete nodded as if he'd already anticipated my next question. I put the rest in an envelope. "Come with me." In the back room, he handed me a small package containing a memory card, the kind that fits inside an old digital recorder. My dad had hidden it inside the watch's hollow bezel, behind a layer of cushioning that wasn't factory standard. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a message. Back at my hotel that night, I watched the file on my laptop. My father had recorded it the week before he died. He was sitting in his workshop, his voice steady but low. "Jordan," he said, "I don't trust the man your mother's been seeing. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and something's not right. Keep the watch safe, and if Derek ever tries to take more than what's his, follow the trail." He didn't explain much more, just enough to awaken a burning awareness in me. My father had known, even back then, that his death wouldn't mean peace. I thought about Tyler, about all the times he smiled through his teeth, how he always had a new project, a new scheme, a new way to spend someone else's resources. I remembered the birthday when he handed out business cards at our family dinner, how my mother brushed it off with pride, and how he always called me the sentimental one, as if emotion was a weakness. I had ignored those moments. I told myself I was being judgmental, overly cautious. But now I saw it for what it was, calculated erosion. They never wanted to keep my father's memory alive. They wanted to bury it. My grief shifted into something sharper, not rage, but resolve. I didn't want to fight them. I didn't want a scene. What I wanted was truth, and to make sure that my father's words weren't left in the shadows of that Rolex. Tyler had taken something sacred, but in doing so, he triggered something irreversible, not just the unlocking of a watch, but the awakening of a plan, because what he didn't know was that my father left more than one layer of protection. I started making calls, not to lawyers, not yet. I called the old banker my father used to meet for lunch, the retired mechanic who once helped install a safe in our garage, and the estate clerk who'd handled the paperwork after Dad passed. Quietly, respectfully, I began piecing together what had been overlooked, or perhaps deliberately concealed. And it was in those conversations that I found the leverage I needed. Leverage Tyler never saw coming. It started with the banker, Mr. Albright. I found him through a mutual connection and requested a short meeting. He remembered my father well. A quiet man, he said, but he thought 10 moves ahead. That Rolex was never just about time. I explained what I'd discovered, without going into too much detail, and asked if my dad had ever mentioned a secondary trust or backup account. Mr. Albright paused, furrowed his brow, and nodded slowly. He did mention something once. Not under his name, said he set it up for when the right hands come looking. My father had been preparing for something long before he died. That account, it turned out, wasn't in my name, but it was tied to a small LLC he had created a year before his passing. No activity had occurred since his death. Inside it was a modest but significant sum of money, more than enough to raise questions. More importantly, it was structured to require dual authorization to access his and a successor he'd named posthumously. That successor was me. Tyler, or anyone connected to Derek, wouldn't have known it even existed. And that wasn't all. The estate clerk confirmed something else I'd never been told. A second will, not a replacement, but a sealed supplement meant to activate under certain conditions, namely if any of my father's personal items were sold or pawned within a specific time frame. That document redirected anything remaining in his name, including that LLC, solely to me. The trigger clause had never been needed before, but by pawning the Rolex, they had unknowingly activated it. And now the clock was ticking. Meanwhile, Tyler was on social media celebrating the launch of his smoothie startup, posing in leased suits and rented lofts, throwing out phrases like angel investors and legacy brands. He had no idea what was building behind the scenes, no clue that the very thing he liquidated to fund his performance, the watch, had just opened a door he couldn't shut. The poetic symmetry wasn't lost on me. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I reached out to a small business acquisition firm. I presented them with a quiet offer to invest in Tyler's company under a shell firm, just enough to gain access to his business model, internal plans, and current funding structure. It was surprisingly easy. He was desperate for capital and flattered by the attention. He didn't know the name behind the deal, just that someone saw potential in his idea. Once inside, it was clear the business was a mess. Undercapitalized, overpriced, and overhyped. But I didn't plan to destroy it outright. I planned to offer just enough rope. I asked my rep to push for one clause: if certain performance metrics weren't met in 90 days, control of the brand and all assets would revert to the minority investor, my firm. Tyler didn't read the fine print. He was too busy planning launch parties and filming ad reels to notice the ground shifting under him. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the principle, about respecting what was sacred, about showing that you don't get to rewrite someone else's legacy just because they're not there to stop you. My father saw this coming, and now I was following his map, not out of vengeance, but out of honor. Tyler's business started with the usual fanfare. Launch day was all over social media. Green smoothies in glass bottles, affirmations printed on expensive packaging, and a rented Tesla parked outside a borrowed studio. My mother posted it all proudly. "So proud of my son's new venture," she wrote, as if none of it had come at the cost of someone else's memory. I didn't comment. I just watched. Every ad, every caption, every promotional deal, all of it served as fuel, because with every move he made, I was tracking how far he'd go before the floor gave out. Within the first month, the startup was already struggling. Logistics were chaotic. Customers complained about late deliveries. The product, despite the packaging, was nothing unique, just overpriced juice in a saturated market. But Tyler kept spending on influencers, on photographers, on catered investor dinners filled with friends pretending to be venture capitalists. He thought he was building an empire, but really he was burning borrowed time, and I had the matchbook. At the 45-day mark, my acquisition firm sent a quiet warning: missed performance benchmarks. Tyler ignored it, said he'd fix everything by the next cycle. I knew he wouldn't, because I'd seen this before, not just in business, but in how he treated people. Flash over substance, style over roots. He hadn't built anything real. He'd simply tried to repackage charm into something that looked like work. And now, the results were catching up to him. Around the 60-day mark, I visited home. I didn't announce it. I just showed up and knocked on the door like I used to. My mother answered, surprised, flustered. "Jordan, what are you doing here?" she asked. I smiled gently, just tying up a few things. Tyler wasn't home, but his laptop sat open on the kitchen table, screens full of spreadsheets, overdue invoices, vendor complaints. The truth was bleeding from every cell. I didn't gloat. I didn't even bring up the watch. I simply asked for tea, sat at the same table where my father once taught me chess, and listened as the silence grew heavy between us. That night, I walked by the garage, the one my father had converted into a workshop before he died. It had been cleaned out, stripped of its essence. But I found the safe still hidden behind the old shelving unit, just as he'd said. Inside it was one last letter, typed this time, signed in ink, a trust reassignment form. He had left it unsigned at the time of his death, probably unsure if it would ever be needed, but I signed it now, legally, cleanly. Everything he had tried to preserve was finally back in the right hands. When the 90-day window closed, Tyler received a letter from the firm. It was over. His shares were revoked. Control had shifted. The business, such as it was mine now, and I didn't even have to show my face. I just let the system finish the sentence he had started. Quiet, efficient, irrefutable. And when the news hit, the posts stopped. The parties disappeared. The rented props were returned. He vanished from the feed he'd once curated so carefully. The firm notified me when Tyler tried to dispute the clause. He hired a lawyer who clearly hadn't read the contract carefully, because within a week they dropped the case entirely. There was nothing to fight. Tyler had signed away his kingdom with a pen he didn't understand, and I had no intention of running his failed venture. I quietly sold off the remaining inventory, paid off the vendors who hadn't been compensated, and shuttered the site with a single notice: "This brand has been dissolved. Thank you for your support." No fanfare, no press release, just silence, like a curtain falling. I never spoke a word of it to my mother. She called a few weeks later, voice tight with confusion. "Did you hear what happened to Tyler's company?" I said I had. "That investor he brought on, they took everything," she murmured, like it was some unfair twist of fate. I said nothing. I let her sit with it. I wasn't trying to punish her, but I also wasn't going to rescue her from a truth she refused to see. My father had warned her, in life, in death, in ink hidden inside a watch. She ignored every sign. What stunned me most was how little I felt when it was over. I thought I'd feel triumph, maybe even satisfaction, but it wasn't revenge that filled me. It was relief. The storm had passed. The weight had lifted. I had done what my father asked without ever raising my voice, without stepping into the mud. And more than that, I had done it without becoming the kind of man Derek or Tyler represented. I stayed quiet, steady, strategic, and it worked. One evening, I returned to the pawn shop. Pete greeted me like an old friend. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing me the Rolex. "It's not for sale anymore, not even if someone offered 10 times what it's worth." I took it with both hands. The watch had been cleaned, polished. The crystal gleamed like it had just come off the line. But it wasn't about the shine. It was about the time it carried, my father's time. His warnings, his voice etched between gears and seconds. I kept the watch on my nightstand. Not on display, just nearby, where I could glance at it and remember what silence could build, what wisdom could protect. Every once in a while, I'd wind it, just to hear it tick. That soft rhythm reminded me that time, like justice, moves forward, whether you notice it or not. Tyler moved on, or tried to. I heard from a cousin that he started another company overseas. Something in crypto. I didn't bother to follow it. It wasn't my concern anymore. I had no need to interfere. Some people only learn by losing everything they thought they deserved, and if he ever paused long enough to wonder why it all fell apart, maybe he'd remember the watch he thought was just a trinket, and the man who never said a word until it was too late. A few months passed, and the dust settled. Life went back to its rhythm, or at least mine did. I poured myself into my work, kept my circle small, and started spending weekends restoring old watches, almost as a quiet tribute to the one that started it all. Each tiny gear, each sapphire crystal reminded me how precision and patience create resilience. You don't rush a mechanism like that. You don't rush healing either. My father had taught me both, in life and long after he was gone. My mother reached out more frequently after the collapse. The tone of her voice softened, less sure of herself, more hesitant, like she was trying to reframe a story that no longer made sense. I listened, politely. I let her speak, but I didn't forget, not because I held a grudge, but because memory is how we protect ourselves from repeating pain. She had chosen her comfort over truth, her convenience over legacy, and while I didn't hate her for it, I also didn't trust her the same way anymore. One day she asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us. We met at a small cafe in the part of town where my dad used to take me for ice cream after Little League. She brought a photo album. I brought the watch. It sat on the table between us, like a silent witness. We flipped pages, we shared memories. she cried. Not loudly, just a quiet leak of guilt. And I could see in her eyes what I'd always hoped for. Not regret for getting caught, but grief for what she had allowed herself to become. I thought I was helping him, she whispered, referring to Tyler. He was so sure this time. And I didn't want to lose another son. That hit me harder than I expected. Because in trying to hold on to one, she'd let go of the other. I nodded slowly. I know, I said. But sometimes when we protect the wrong people, we end up betraying the right ones. We didn't hug, we didn't reconcile completely. But in that moment, something shifted. A slow forgiveness, not as a gift, but as a boundary. She would never cross that line again. The following week, I returned to my apartment and opened a wooden box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were my dad's cufflinks, a worn leather journal, and a photo of the two of us fishing by the lake. I placed the Rolex beside them, nestled in velvet once more. It had done its job. The timepiece had carried more than hours. It had carried truth, identity, legacy, and now it could rest. I wasn't the same man who flew home in silence. I had walked through betrayal without rage, navigated vengeance without violence, and found power in patience. And though Tyler would never fully understand what happened, maybe that was the point. Real justice doesn't come with applause. It comes with clarity, and in the quiet, I found mine. Word spread slowly, like fog creeping over a familiar path. The rest of the family began asking quiet questions. Cousins who used to dismiss me as the shy one reached out with curiosity in their voices. No one said it directly, but I could feel it. They had sensed a shift in the air. Something had happened, and it wasn't just business. It was deeper, a change in the way legacy was spoken about in our family. For the first time in years, my father's name was being mentioned with reverence, not as an afterthought. An aunt called me unexpectedly one afternoon. She'd always stayed neutral, but now she wanted to know the truth. I told her some of it, not the strategic pieces. Those were mine to carry, but the emotional core, the betrayal, the note, the quiet revenge. When I finished, she said something I'll never forget. Your dad would have been proud, Jordan. You protected what mattered without becoming what hurt you. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, because that's exactly what I had fought to do. I began to realize how many people live in silence, people with similar stories, quiet betrayals, stolen legacies, or voices that were ignored in favor of flashier ones. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood my father's decision to hide that note, to leave a trail. He knew the world wouldn't make it easy. He knew that sometimes you don't fight the world head-on. You let the truth outlast the noise. You let integrity do what anger never could. I wrote an article anonymously and submitted it to a small legacy journal, one that focused on family, inheritance and ethics. I titled it, "What a Watch Taught Me About Quiet Power." It gained traction faster than I expected. Readers reached out, some cried, some thanked me, a few even sent photos of heirlooms they'd retrieved from pawn shops, inspired by the story. I had started a ripple, not out of revenge, but out of restoration. I didn't respond to most of the messages. I didn't need the attention. But I printed each one and kept them in a folder marked "He would have smiled," because I knew he would have. My father never asked for much. Just honesty, resilience, and a willingness to stand for something quietly. I had done that, and now I was watching others do the same. And yet, one message stood out. It came from someone I never expected to hear from again. The email subject line was simple. "I think we need to talk." The sender, Derek, my mother's husband. A man I hadn't heard from directly in over a decade. He was never outright cruel, just always dismissive. He treated me like a house guest, like someone passing through his world rather than part of his family. I stared at his name for a long time before opening the message. Inside was a short note. I didn't know about the watch. I didn't know what was inside. But I should have. I'm sorry, if you'll let me, I'd like to meet. I didn't reply immediately. I wasn't sure if he meant it, but curiosity and maybe something deeper nudged me to accept. We met in a neutral space, a public garden near the harbor. He was older now, thinner. Some of the arrogance had weathered off. He looked like a man who had finally been humbled, not by others but by time. We sat in silence for a few minutes before he finally said, "I was so busy trying to make Tyler succeed, I never noticed who was already steady." I listened. He admitted that when my dad passed, he stepped into the household like a replacement rather than a support. I thought I had to take charge. I didn't realize I was erasing someone who had already done the job better than I ever could. That struck me. It wasn't an excuse, it was a realization. A little too late, perhaps, but real. And in that moment, I decided I wouldn't punish him. Not because he deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved my peace. "I'm not angry anymore," I said, "but I needed to make sure my father's name wasn't treated like an old receipt. I had to do something, Derek. Not for revenge, for honor." He nodded, looking away. "I understand now." We stood, exchanged a final handshake, and went our separate ways. That meeting didn't heal the past, but it placed a stone on it, like a headstone. Something to mark the lesson. Weeks later, I found myself at the lake where Dad and I used to fish. I brought a thermos of coffee, a folding chair, and the Rolex. I didn't say anything to the wind, didn't whisper into the sky. I just sat with the silence, with the steady tick of the watch in my palm, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer holding grief. I was holding gratitude. That was the real victory. Not the fall of Tyler, not the closure with my mother, not even the transfer of power. It was the knowledge that I had protected something fragile with strength, and that my father, wherever he was, could rest knowing that what he left behind was not sold off or wasted, but guarded, understood, and eventually passed forward with wisdom. Just like that, I stood, pocketed the watch, and walked away from the lake, a son no longer chasing justice, but carrying it. A few months after that day at the lake, I received another message. This one came in the mail, a letter, handwritten on heavy paper. It was from Tyler. I was surprised to see his name, and even more surprised by the content. It wasn't a defense or a justification. It was a confession, he wrote. I didn't know what the watch meant. I only saw something valuable, not something sacred. I thought I was doing what people expected of me, making something of myself. But now I know, I took what wasn't mine to take. There was no plea for forgiveness, only the kind of awkward honesty that people use when they're trying to learn how to tell the truth for the first time. He said he'd left the country to get space, and that the business failure had made him confront things he'd buried for years. Entitlement, pride, insecurity. "You always had something I didn't," he wrote. "Not money, not status. Peace." I didn't write back, but I didn't burn the letter either. I folded it and placed it inside the same wooden box that held my father's things. Not because I forgave him, not fully, but because I wanted to mark the moment when someone finally took responsibility. Even if it came too late, it still mattered. Sometimes, acknowledgement is enough to loosen the tightest knots. From there, something unexpected happened. My relationship with my mother began to shift. We didn't return to what we had before. That would have been dishonest. But we found a new kind of connection, simpler, wiser. I set boundaries, and she respected them. I told her about the second will, about the hidden account, about the trust. She cried again. Not from guilt this time, but from the sheer weight of truth finally landing after years of denial. "He tried to protect you even after he was gone," she whispered. I nodded, and I listened. In time, she began to speak about my father differently, with more reverence. Less editing. She told me stories I hadn't heard, about their early years, about his laugh, about the day he bought the Rolex. "He never bought anything for himself," she said. "But that watch, it was like he knew he'd need to leave something behind." Her voice cracked, and I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in years: humility. And as for me, I didn't become someone else. I didn't turn the story into a brand or a speaking tour or a dramatic memoir. I just lived, a little quieter, a little stronger. I wore the watch sometimes not to show off, but to feel connected. I still worked with my hands, still listened more than I spoke, still remembered that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when wronged is stay silent, plan carefully, and let time, like that old Rolex, do what it was made to do. It's strange how a single object can become a doorway, not just to the past, but to clarity. That Rolex wasn't about money, it wasn't even about time. It was about presence, my father's presence, etched into every tick, every silent warning he left behind, and in the end, it did what he intended it to do. It found its way back to me when I needed it most. Not when I was angry, not when I was lost, but when I was ready. I kept the watch, but I also made a decision. I would build something of my own, something worth passing on. I used the remaining funds from the trust to quietly start a mentorship program for young men without fathers. Nothing flashy, just guidance, patience, and practical tools. Things my father had given me in his quiet way. I didn't put my name on it. It wasn't about recognition. It was about completing the cycle, turning pain into purpose, betrayal into blueprint. One of the young men in the program, Marcus, reminded me of myself at 16, smart, observant, unsure of his place in the world. One day, after a workshop, he asked, "Why do you wear an old watch when everyone else has a smart watch?" I smiled, because this one doesn't buzz with distractions. It just keeps time, honestly, quietly, like someone I once knew. He didn't ask more. He just nodded, like he understood there was more to the story than I was telling, and respected that silence. My mother eventually downsized and moved to a quieter town. She invited me to help her pack. As we boxed up old photo albums and dishes, I found a framed picture of my father, one I hadn't seen in years. He was younger, holding me on his shoulders at a carnival, both of us laughing mid-motion. She looked at it too and said softly, "I see him in you more now than I ever did when he was alive." I didn't reply, but I felt it. The full circle ache of love, grief, and the kind of justice only time delivers. "And Tyler?" He faded from the conversation. As quietly as he'd risen, he vanished. I hear things that he's trying to rebuild, that he's staying out of trouble, but he doesn't contact me. I think he knows not to. Not out of fear, but out of respect. He finally learned the limits of charm, that legacy cannot be stolen, only earned, protected, or lost forever. I still wind the Rolex once a week. Still listen to that soft, steady tick in the early mornings before the world wakes up. It reminds me that time is not a weapon. It's a witness, and I've learned, through betrayal, through silence, through quiet victory, that the ones who honor time are the ones who leave behind something eternal. My name is Jordan Ellis, and this is how I kept my father's promise without ever raising my voice.